Hello historians and welcome back. Today we will be exploring the early life of King Edward VI. Normally I would say while he was Prince of Wales, but Henry VIII never gave Edward the title of Prince of Wales.
This is awkward.
So it's just going to be while he's Prince Edward. Edward was an extremely precocious child, like his sister Elizabeth. He was solemn and serious. He was only known to laugh out loud, I think, once in his life. I don't know how true that is. This was not helped by his father, who was overly protective, and he isolated him from court life, which hindered him from acquiring the social and empathy skills that a human being needs. King Henry VIII was an affectionate but distant father. Edward's own mother died when he was a few days old, and the only stepmother to provide him with a stable mother's love was Catherine Parr. Catherine was able to win Edward's affections, but she was too late to fix the emotional damage that he had suffered, and as such, Edward comes across cold and sometimes even heartless. King Edward VI, or as he is at the moment, Prince Edward, was born on the 12th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, to King Henry VIII and his Queen Jane Seymour. However, he wasn't the only Edward born that day, as his cousin Edward Seymour was also born in another suite at the palace. Henry was elated when Edward was born, as he finally had a legitimate male heir, something that he had been hoping for since 1509. That's just shy of 3 decades.
Breathtaking. I shall call him Mini-Me.
Edward was christened on the 15th of October 1537 in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the Duke of Norfolk, the Duke of Suffolk, and his sister, the Lady Mary, were assigned as godparents. His sister, the Lady Elizabeth, was carried by Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, in the procession. She was holding the chrysobal tightly in her small fists. Once baptised and named heir, Edward was conveyed back to the Queen's apartments, followed by his 2 sisters. Elizabeth walked holding Mary's hand. Edward's mother, Queen Jane Seymour, died from childbirth complications on the 24th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, 12 days after he was born. So Edward never knew his mother, and she was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 12th of November. Edward's father wore black for 3 months after his mother's death. In May of 1538, Edward was 7 months old, and his father had spent the whole day playing with his son. Henry carried Edward around in his arms for a long time and held him up to the window for crowds to see the prince. Henry's obsession to protect Edward, to protect his heir, made him sensitive to any hint of treason, and that summer, Edward was brought to Hampton Court Palace to be with his sisters. On the 6th of January 1540, King Henry VIII married wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, who became Edward's first of many stepmothers, though she would not last long as his father divorced her on the 12th of July 1540.
That was fast.
Only to marry his second stepmother, Catherine Howard, days later on the 28th of July 1540. It is unknown what Edward thought of his second stepmother Catherine, as he would have been 4 when she died. Honestly, I imagine that Prince Edward had little to do with her than the customary pleasantries, and his father at that time seemed to be too interested in his wife than anything else. Henry was paranoid and frightened of illness. After all, the sweating sickness had taken his brother Arthur unexpectedly, as well as both of his sons, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, and Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond. As a result, Henry had the floors and walls of Edward's rooms washed down 3 times a day with soap to keep them free from disease. To compensate for his absence, Henry showered Edward with gifts and allowed him to indulge in a diet of rich foods. In 1541, a troupe of minstrels was appointed to entertain the prince by his father, who was determined to give Edward anything and everything he wanted. Edward also found his education extremely tiresome, despite being a prodigy. So his father had his school books enamelled with gold and set with rubies, sapphires and diamonds. His cutlery was studded with precious stones, and his napkins sparkled with gold and silver thread.
Right.
In May 1542, a rumour spread throughout the court that Prince Edward was ill. He wasn't, and it was false. But the shock at the thought of losing the prince prompted Parliament and the Privy Council to remind the king of the need for a spare. The November of the same year saw the Battle of Solway Moss. Edward's father, King Henry, was hoping for an alliance between Scotland and England. But Scotland wasn't interested, so Henry thought he could beat them into submission. England won the battle, and within days, King James V of Scotland returned to Falkland's Palace and died on the 14th of December. With the death of the King of Scots, it meant that his daughter, the 6-year-old Mary Stuart, was now Queen of Scotland, and King Henry VIII saw this as an opportunity to arrange an alliance between Scotland and England by marrying Edward and Mary. Henry wasted no time and sent envoys to the Queen Regent, Mary of Guise, to lay his proposal for the marriage. On the 1st of January 1543, Edward, now 5, performed his first public duty. He entertained the Scottish nobles that were captured at Solway Moss. The Scottish nobles praised him for his conduct, and it was noted how he looked like his mother, the late Queen Jane Seymour. He was fair like Jane, and displayed a cheerful manner like his mother, but facially he looked like his father. Many would later view Edward as a tyrant like his father too, or at least he had the potential to do so had he not died so early.
He's too dangerous to be left alive.
1st of July 1543, the Treaty of Greenwich was signed, which promised at the age of 10, Mary I of Scotland would marry Edward and move to England, where Henry could oversee her upbringing. Quite hilarious in hindsight, because obviously Henry wouldn't make it for another 10 years.
It's funny because it's true.
The treaty stipulated that the two countries would remain legally separate, and if the couple should fail to have children, the temporary union would dissolve. Similar to the marriage treaty that Edward's sister Mary would have when she married her husband, King Philip II of Spain. 12th of July 1543, Henry married yet again, this time to Catherine Parr, who became Edward's third and final stepmother. She was warm and tried to create a family unit. Catherine took an interest in education and had originally overseen Edward's sister, the Lady Elizabeth's education. King Henry was so impressed with Catherine's choice that he then asked for her advice when it came to Edward's education, which started later that year. Like Elizabeth, Edward was to have a rigorous Protestant education, and the two would go on to share classes together. Edward would visit court less frequently than his sisters, for his father, the king, feared that he might catch a disease. This did not stop Catherine from taking an interest in her stepson, and eventually he would come to love his stepmother as much as a cold-hearted person like Edward could love anyone. Though, like I said previously, it's not his fault that he turned out this way. The Treaty of Greenwich was rejected in the December of 1543 by the Scottish Parliament. It had been suggested that Prince Edward was not good enough for the Scottish Queen.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity and the gumption.
And they probably didn't like the stipulation of her leaving Scotland, although they had no problem sending her to France. So I rest my case. As you can imagine, Henry reacted to this rejection quite calmly. Or any normal person would, but Henry, no. Henry was like, "You're going to reject me and my son? I'm going to ransack your towns." So he set ablaze Scottish towns that sat on the border.
You what?
This 8-year war between England and Scotland became known as the Rough Wooing. This was England's attempt to secure a marriage alliance with Scotland, and I'm sure that setting Scotland's towns and villages alight is the best way to convince anyone to marry you. On the 2nd of August 1545, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, died. Charles Brandon was a very close friend of Edward's father, Henry. Charles had left behind a widow and 2 young sons. The elder son, Henry, was aged 10. He succeeded to the title of Duke of Suffolk and was sent to join the household of Prince Edward. As I mentioned earlier, Edward and Elizabeth's education was strict and rigorous. Edward kept a diary, and he wrote in his diary that it was to satisfy the good expectation of the King's Majesty, my father. From this I get the feeling that Edward was so devoted to his education, to impress his father, to get acknowledgement and recognition, something that we also see with Elizabeth, both of whom devoted almost every waking hour to books and religious studies. In August 1546, King Henry VIII knew he was dying, and so he sent his son some presents, chains, rings, and jewelled buttons. In return, he received this from his son, and I will let you interpret it how you will. You grant me all these, not that I should be proud and think too much of myself, but that you might urge me to the pursuit of all true virtues and piety, and adorn and furnish me with all the accomplishments which are fitting a prince. King Henry VIII dictated his will on the 30th of December 1546. He left his crown and kingdom to Edward and lined out his wish for the line of succession. His will states that after his children, he wants it to go through his sister Mary Tudor's children rather than Margaret's, as they sit on the Scottish throne. Henry made it clear that he does not want a Scot on the throne unless it is as Edward's consort. Edward received portraits of his father and stepmother as New Year's gifts on the 10th of January 1547. He wrote back to Catherine Parr, thanking her for her gifts. His response hints at how he is warming to Catherine as a motherly figure, as he calls her the most illustrious queen and dearest mother. What is rather sad is that Edward had no idea how ill his father was at this time. However, both Henry and Catherine had decided to spare him the burden of knowing that his father was dying and that his kingship was imminent. This could be their way of trying to preserve his childhood for as long as they can, as that will be ripped away from him the moment that Henry dies. Although I use the word childhood in its loosest term, Edward's so-called childhood didn't exactly seem much fun. King Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547 at Whitehall Palace at the age of 55. Edward was not told of his father's death immediately. Edward was at Hertford Castle when his uncle, Lord Protector, arrived on the 30th of January. He took the young king to Enfield to see his sister Elizabeth, where the two children were informed of their father's passing. Edward was 9 and Elizabeth was 13. They cried, and neither of them were consolable. Edward was brought to London on the 31st of January, where he was proclaimed king. Edward was 9 when he became king. On the 14th of January 1547, the body of the late king began its last journey. A coffin that was covered in a cloth of gold. Resting on the coffin was a wax effigy of the king, dressed in velvet adorned with precious stones. Banners were carried aloft in the procession, but only 2 of Henry's 6 wives were represented: Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, and Catherine Parr. Henry had not considered his other marriages worthy of commemoration. Henry's funeral was on the 6th of February 1547. Henry was laid to rest at Windsor Castle in St. George's Chapel, next to Edward's mother Jane Seymour. At the end of the service, the herald cried, "Le roi est mort! Vive le roi! The king is dead! Live the king!" The young King Edward VI cried, and he wrote in his diary, "This consoles us that he is now in heaven, and that he have gone out of this miserable world into happy and everlasting blessedness." The Regency Council made it clear that Edward would not be allowed to see his stepmother or his sisters, as they were jealous of any potential outside influence. Edward missed their company and was upset to learn in the February that Catherine Parr would be retiring to the old manor at Chelsea, to which he wrote, "Farewell, venerate Queen," as he knew he would rarely see her again. Edward would be crowned king at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of February 1547. On the eve of his coronation, he led a procession through London from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey. The procession suddenly stops at St. Paul's Cathedral, and everyone is confused. Edward had stopped because he saw an acrobat. He was only 9, He laughed and watched, and then continued. And for a boy who was so serious and hardly laughed, that makes this story even more endearing. A special crown had to be made for Edward's coronation, as the St. Edward's crown was too big, and the imperial crown was too big and too heavy. He was coronated with the heavy crowns, and then finally switched to the new crown, which he wore for the rest of the ceremony. The ceremony was also shortened, as the adults were concerned that the boy king would get tired. Edward Tudor became King of England upon the death of his father, King Henry VIII, on the 28th of January 1547, and Edward was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of February the same year. Prior to her marriage to King Henry VIII, Edward's stepmother and now Queen Dowager Catherine Parr had been romantically involved with Edward's uncle, Sir Thomas Seymour, Lord Sudeley. However, the relationship had to stop when Edward's father, King Henry, had decided he wanted to marry Catherine. Now that Henry was dead, Thomas and Catherine were free to resume their relationship, and by the March, Thomas had proposed to Catherine. The couple would have to seek permission from the Privy Council to wed. However, Thomas knew that the council would be unlikely to approve the match, in case Catherine was pregnant with Henry's child, and then there would be a discrepancy about the baby's paternity. However, Thomas had a good relationship with his nephew, the king, so he thought he would get round it that way. Unfortunately, being the king, getting an audience with Edward would be hard, so Thomas bribed John Fowler, a royal servant, to get the feelers out to see how the young king would feel about Thomas marrying Catherine and what his response might be. According to Fowler, Edward was amazed to learn that his uncle was not yet married, and when Fowler asked the king who he thought his uncle should marry, he suggested Anne of Cleves. He then thought again. I would he married my sister Mary, to turn her opinions. Edward was a Protestant and did not like the idea that his sister Mary was a Catholic. This was not the answer that Lord Sudeley had wanted.
Pretty obvious.
He was aware that the Privy Council kept Edward short of money. After all, he was a child, and his father had nearly bankrupted the country on several occasions. The next night, Sudeley sent Fowler back to see the king, but this time with gold coins. He got Fowler to ask the king if he should be contented I should marry the queen. Edward was fond of both his uncle and his stepmother, and agreed. Being only 9, he did not understand the political motive behind his uncle's proposal. Meanwhile, the Privy Council were trying to arrange a marriage between Edward and Elizabeth of France, the daughter of the new French king, Henri II. The only issue was that Elizabeth was a Roman Catholic. Uncle Thomas thought that he had a better idea of trying to arrange a marriage between his nephew the king and Lady Jane Grey. Jane also had a claim to the English throne. She was the same age as Edward, was named after his mother Queen Jane, and she was a Protestant. Jane's father, however, was not so keen on the idea and kept Jane at home, away from Lord Sudeley. On the 30th of May 1547, King Edward wrote a letter of congratulations to his stepmother, Dowager Queen Catherine, on her marriage to his uncle Thomas Seymour. This made Catherine England's most married queen, as this was her 4th marriage. Edward was supportive of the match, and in his letter spoke affectionately of the great love Catherine had shown to his father, her goodwill towards himself, and lastly, her godliness and knowledge in learning and the scriptures. He then added, if there was anything wherein I may do you a kindness, either in word or deed, I will do it willingly. Catherine responded by begging the king to plead her case with the council, which he did at the beginning of June, saying that he had known that his uncle had intended to marry Catherine, and that he had sent a letter signifying his approval. To that the king's uncle, Edward Seymour, Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, could say nothing, and he and the Privy Council were powerless to stop Thomas. It gave the king great pleasure to think that he had helped make a match that made two people that he cared about so happy. Edward wrote to his stepmother when he could, and when he could not, he sent her a message of goodwill, and his uncle Thomas, in return, sent him secret pocket money. Nothing like a bit of bribery to keep the king sweet. Edward's reign also saw the last battle of the Rough Wooing, as Edward himself and the Privy Council had lost interest in Scotland.
I can't go through with it.
You don't see me complaining.
And the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh took place on the 10th of September, 1547. As you may have guessed, England won this battle, so let's talk about it. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Scots. Sorry, Scotland. The English army was led by Lord Protector Somerset against the Scottish for their failure to fulfil their promise to betroth Mary, Queen of Scots, to the now King Edward VI. However, Edward Seymour wasn't that great, as the numpty failed to agree proper peace terms before returning home.
You blew it!
A year later, on the 5th of September 1548, the woman who the king viewed to be his mother, Catherine Parr, died from childbirth complications at Sudeley Castle. 1549 is the year that Edward's tyranny starts. In the January, the first Book of Common Prayer was published to try and establish uniformity of worship for all. All Catholic items such as statues, holy water and stained glass windows were gone. His uncle Thomas Seymour is arrested on the 16th for trying to break into Edward's privy apartments in a desperate act to save his own skin, and was beheaded on the 20th of March. The summer saw Kett's rebellion, where those in the north of England, mainly in Norwich, were revolting as the common land that people used to collect firewood, grow crops and graze cattle was being bought up by the rich, meaning people couldn't afford to feed themselves, and they were becoming disgruntled towards the lords who were buying the land. Robert Kett, a wealthy landowner, sided with the rebels. They stormed the city of Norwich and secured food and weapons in a city that provided them a tactical advantage. With an army of around 12,000, King Edward could no longer ignore the rebellion and sent John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, with 14,000 troops and mercenaries to squash the rebellion. Kett moved his troops to open ground, which was a terrible idea as this is where Warwick excelled. 250 of the king's men were killed. Edward's army killed 3,000 rebels. His sister, the so-called Bloody Mary, by the way, killed 300 Protestants in her reign, so who was worse? Kett, as the leader of the rebels, was found guilty of treason and executed. Autumn 1549 saw the downfall of the king's other uncle, Edward Seymour, Lord Protector. On the 6th of October, Lord Protector dragged Edward out of bed and took him to the fortified Windsor Castle, as the Privy Council had turned on him for being too liberal with rebels, and his nephew was his only safety net. The two Edwards rode from Hampton Court to Windsor at about 9 o'clock at night and secured the king within the stronghold's walls. The king was outraged by his uncle's actions. He had essentially kidnapped a king. The king had caught a minor cold from the late night journey and exaggerated the symptoms, constantly complaining about the quality of the accommodation at Windsor. Rude. I'll have you know that was one of Queen Elizabeth II's favourite castles, you little snot. Anyway, it was apparently damp and he was bored. Seymour was running low on provisions and the king nearly starved. Seymour eventually lost his nerve and was taken to the Tower, where he was charged with 29 cases of treason. The charges were flimsy, but Seymour had fallen out of favour with his nephew, the king, and his blind panic was his downfall. Edward Seymour, the former Lord Protector, was executed on the 22nd of January 1552. In spring 1550, Charles V sent ambassadors to England to ask the king for a special licence to allow Mary to practice Mass. Edward said no. Charles sent some ships to come get Mary from Essex, but she was unable to escape as English ships had blocked the way. Mary was Edward's legal heir, and therefore she couldn't be touched. but that didn't stop Edward from imprisoning her priests. Mary would later lead a Catholic protest in London on the 18th of March 1551, showing disrespect to her little brother. When his uncle was beheaded at Tower Hill on the 22nd of January 1552, Edward was very cold and heartless about it, writing in his diary, "The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning." He also recorded in his diary that he suffered from a bout of measles and smallpox, which may have damaged his immune system and contributed to his early death. January 1553, Edward falls ill, with a fever and a cough. Worried about the fate of the crown, he wrote his device for the succession. He soon recovered, only to fall victim to measles in the April. These two close bouts of illness had exhausted the king, and his swollen body developed ulcers. Edward's cousin, the Lady Jane Grey, married Lord Guildford Dudley, the son of the Earl of Warwick, and brother to Elizabeth I's favourite, Robert Dudley. They married at Durham Place. Edward was still sick and was unable to attend the wedding, but provided lavish clothes for the wedding. John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, now the Duke of Northumberland, convinced Edward to make his two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, illegitimate, and named Dudley's daughter-in-law and Edward's cousin, Jane, as heir. When thinking about the succession, remember Edward was ill for some of it, so he could have been easily manipulated. Edward wanted the country to remain Protestant to continue the Reformation that he had started in his reign. For this, Elizabeth was an obvious choice. She was 19, but Edward viewed her as illegitimate, as her mother Anne Boleyn had been executed for treason, so their father could marry Edward's mother, Jane. Also, like a true Protestant, Edward wanted a male heir and didn't want to leave it to a female. However, all living heirs to the English throne at that time were female. So that's Elizabeth out. Mary was also illegitimate, and even worse, she was a 37-year-old unmarried woman who was Catholic, and she was unlikely to have children. His father's will explicitly skipped over his Scottish family, which left Frances Grey and her children, Jane, Catherine and Mary, all of whom were Protestant. Initially, it was left to Frances Grey, Jane's mum, but it was unlikely Frances would have more children, so it went down to Jane and any male heirs that she may produce, hopefully with John Dudley's son Guildford, which meant that the throne wasn't being given to Jane, only her male children. John Dudley had sacked Edward's doctor for a wise woman who gave the king arsenic. This worsened his condition and made him hysterical. Until Edward added two more words to the document of succession. And her. So it now read as the Lady Jane and her heirs male, putting Jane in the line of succession with or without heirs. It's clear that the handwriting in the document is Edward's, but what is not clear is whose idea it was. Was it Edward's idea, or was he influenced by John Dudley? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Dudley then sacked the wise woman and called back the royal doctor, but it was too late. King Edward II died on the 6th of July 1553 and was buried in the Henry VII Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey on the 8th of August 1553. I hope you enjoyed this look into the reign of King Edward VI. If you did, please like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. But until then, have a wonderful day.